Hello, my fellow gun theorists. Welcome to Gun Theory. Today, we're taking a look at how flash hiders work. And should they be something to be feared, as you constantly hear in the news media? But before we get into the meat, make sure you hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications. As we get into the school year, our schedule is going to go down from Tuesdays and Thursdays to just Thursdays, most likely, with still bonus content on some Fridays. So to understand how flash hiders work and what need we have for them, we first have to understand exactly what happens in the barrel as you fire a bullet in any gun without a muzzle device. So with this handgun, here is the chamber here. When we fire, there's obviously a powder propellant charge that is ignited, it combusts, and as it combusts, it creates a whole bunch of propellant gas. And so the gas builds up, and it's very hot, by the way, and it builds up in higher pressure the more the gunpowder burns, and the only direction it has to vent is forward. Normally, it wants to expand in all directions evenly, sort of forming an orb. But in this case, we make the movement forward the only weak spot in the system, so it goes forward, pushes the bullet out, and then as soon as it gets to the muzzle here, we'll notice there's no muzzle device on this gun, it'll flash in kind of an orb. And it's a very brief momentary flash. You won't actually see it with your eyes or with a camera on every single gunshot, but it is there. So let's look at this with just the barrel out of the gun and not just with the gun fully assembled. All right, so here we have our barrel, and most handgun barrels will look pretty much like this, possibly with a longer barrel or shorter one. So the chamber is here. You'll actually notice we've got a bit of a dirty chamber. But as the cartridge is fired, the bullet passes down the barrel with a whole bunch of really hot propellant gases constantly building in pressure behind it. And then as the bullet leaves the muzzle entirely, that gas, trying to expand in all directions but being forced in this direction, as soon as it leaves the muzzle, boom, it starts to expand in the orb shape as soon as it can. And that orb is filled with burning gunpowder, very hot gases. It creates a bit of a flash of fire. And it's very, very brief. So it makes it pretty apparent if you're shooting in a low light condition, or maybe you're in the shade, the shooter is in the shade, that flash becomes even more obvious than if you're firing outdoors in the middle of a sunny day. And this flash can be seen maybe on the battlefield. Your enemy soldiers, if they're shooting from a shaded, covered position, it'll be a little bit more obvious that their flash is that way. So you'll be able to direct your fire towards the enemy and hopefully be effective. So we've developed a device called a flash hider. And today we'll be looking at the A2 birdcage style of flash hider. One thing to note on this as we're looking at it, the upper receiver is entirely off. There's no bolt in here, so this is not actually even considered a firearm, this part of it. So the upper receiver has been made safe so that we can point it at the camera. So here we have an A2 birdcage style of flash hider. Now they all work on basically the exact same principles, they just might use different geometry than this one or other ones to do that job. So we'll notice here that we actually have a crush washer, and then the birdcage begins. And this surface, these flat surfaces that you'll notice here, where it should be pretty rounded and then it just becomes flat, that's actually to allow a wrench to grab on and to put this on or off of a barrel. So the barrels of most modern sporting rifles, such as an AR-15, are threaded on the outside at the end. So you simply screw it on with a crush washer to allow it to be indexed properly. It actually matters where it ends up being in this particular flash hider. Not all of them actually matter. But this one, if we look a little closer and get this camera to focus, we'll notice that it has these slots. And it has those slots on the top all the way to almost exactly at the sides. But then, nothing. No slots. It's just flat metal at this point. That's important for just a moment after we look here. So we'll note that the actual hole, and this is very important for determining a flash hider versus a compensator or muzzle brake that we'll be looking at in our next video, that the hole is actually quite large. The .223 bullet is tiny, yet we can fit our fingers in here. My pinky can go all the way in. If the hole is bigger than it needs to be for the bullet, it's a flash hider. Because muzzle brakes and compensators, they need the hole to be perfectly sized for the bullet. So as the bullet passes through that hole, it creates a gas seal. But for this video, we're not going to talk about that. All we need to know is that on a flash hider, the hole is a lot bigger than it actually needs to be to allow the bullet to come through. So back to those slots and then the lack of slots on the bottom. So as the gas leaves the barrel and it enters this space, it again is wanting to expand in like an orb sort of shape, evenly in all directions, more or less. And so as soon as it leaves the muzzle, it wants to go every direction. But the bottom blocks it, and then these slits here, these slots, allow it to come out. And it actually creates a bit of a star pattern without the bottom of the star. So instead of a bright orb of flash, it actually creates like the top half of a star shape sort of a flash. It's still there. And then a little bit of the gas does still vent out of the tip here, but most of it has already vented and created your flash by the time it gets into the slots. So not much actually continues out past the flash hider. So why is that? And how does that do anything? Because it seems like we're just redirecting the flash rather than hiding the flash, like the name might imply. Well, on the bottom, the reason it has no slots is because if you were to direct the gas down at all, and you're shooting from a prone or a low crouched position, any dirt, debris, sand, anything on the ground that you're shooting near is going to get disturbed by this hot stream of gas suddenly blasting into it, and then you're going to have a cloud of dirt or sand or whatever you're shooting in go all around you. It might obscure your vision, it might make you more obvious to the enemy, or it might get on your gun and gum up your gun. So none of those things are good. So on flash hiders, the effective ones, you'll notice that they almost never have any slots in the bottom for that reason. But let's talk about the star. Does that actually hide the flash? Should we be a little bit fearful of flash hiders on modern civilian rifles and only allow them to the military? Well, when the gas vents in this star shape, that creates an angle sort of like this, more or less. Anyone in front that falls within that angle, it actually makes the flash more apparent. The big star shape is quite a bit more apparent than just an orb. So anyone more or less in front of the shooter, it's actually more obvious where that shot is coming from with a flash hider like this one. That's not actually what this is designed to do. A lot of people, and the name would imply as well, that it's supposed to hide the flash altogether, but it doesn't. It redirects it for some pretty clever geometry. So anyone in front of the muzzle, it's going to be more apparent where that shot came from. Hopefully, if you're the soldier or it's your soldiers of your country, that person will no longer be in the fight because they've just been shot at. Hopefully a hit lands on them, so they're no longer there to tell their buddies about that shooter, but all their buddies next to them would still see that muzzle flash, quite apparently. Where that becomes good though, where it actually starts to hide the flash, is outside of that angle, a little bit outside of that angle. So anyone to the sides of the shooter, instead of seeing this bright star pattern, they see a vertical line because they're looking on from the side. So all they see is a vertical line. They can still see it, but it's way less apparent than a big spread out shape or a big orb. It's just a line. So obviously that's lower profile, and there's a lower chance of them being able to see it from the side. And that comes in really good handy in, say, the jungles of Vietnam or in the Middle East and the conflicts that America and other countries have been involved in there. Most of those people used guerrilla tactics. They were guerrilla fighters. And what that means is that they used a lot of sneaky techniques and strategies. And so you didn't always know, if you were a soldier fighting guerrillas, where the enemy was. If you maybe found an enemy straight ahead, you could shoot at him. But if you had that big orb where it was more apparent to everyone around you, you had no idea if there were enemies to your left or right or even slightly behind you at an angle. And so the flash was about the same in terms of how obvious it was to anyone in any direction from the shooter. And that's not very good, because if there's someone to your side, they're already flanking you, and they didn't even have to do a whole lot except sit there. And that's really not good for you. So in a battlefield condition, it doesn't hide the flash at all. It simply redirects it so that people from the sides will have a harder time telling that that's where the gunshot came from. But anyone in front of the shooter, well, it's more obvious actually that there's a shot coming from over there, let's say. So should we actually be scared of them? I would argue no. One thing that it does do for civilian purpose is that the flash can be very distracting, especially if you're like at an indoor range or in a shaded area at an outdoor range. If you're shaded, that bright flash is more apparent just to anyone in general. And so it will actually distract your eyes from looking at your sight picture, and you'll have to re-get your sight picture, and it's just a little bit annoying to constantly get distracted by the muzzle flash of your own rifle. So that's one thing that it does for us. That's very good for competition shooting, just sport shooting for fun, or even hunting. But more importantly, the reason people are scared of flash hiders, the reason we need to ask this question, is for situations like mass shooters or people who want to do other people harm with firearms. Usually it's innocent people that have nothing to do with the person who's decided to do this. They just want to cause as much human death and suffering as they possibly can in a very short period of time. These are very despicable people, obviously. It goes without saying even. So does this flash hider give those despicable people any advantage in being more effective at the awful things that they're trying to do? Well, let's take a look and let's think about a few instances and just in general where and when these shootings tend to happen. One that was particularly disturbing to me was the Las Vegas shooting, when that man was up in a window at a hotel shooting down on crowds of people. He was using AR platforms of rifles. And most likely he had a flash hider exactly like this one, an A2. It comes on pretty much all commercial AR-15s because it's cheap and it's easy to put on. Well, what angle were the people at who were in a place to see the muzzle flash of the shooter so they can identify where it's at and inform the police to go kick that door in and make sure he stops shooting? Well, pretty much all of them were in front of the shooter in that angle. So the muzzle flash would have actually been the most apparent to anyone down there being shot at. And it would have been even more apparent than if he didn't have a flash hider, especially if his hotel room lights had been turned off. I don't know for sure if they were, but especially if he was shooting from a dark shaded area into the light area outside, it would have been very obvious where that flash was coming from anyone in front of the gun, anyone being shot at. And then from the sides, it would have been a little bit less apparent. But if you were shooting from indoors, you probably wouldn't have seen the muzzle flash anyways from the sides, because he was inside of a window. So in that instance, if he was using a flash hider, it wouldn't have helped him at all be any more effective at what he was doing. In fact, it probably made it a little bit more obvious, hey, the gunshots are coming from that window right there, because the star-shaped flash is quite a bit more obvious in front of the gun. And in most other instances, usually mass shootings and shootings of that nature take place in pretty crowded, close quarters areas. So this flash hider really is not useful even from the sides in a close quarters situation. This is more for a matter of like hundreds of meters away, hundreds of yards away from the sides. This flash hider doesn't really do a whole lot up close. In fact, it's mostly useless up close. So in a close quarter shooting, let's say we're in a shopping center like Walmart and someone decides to open fire with a rifle with one of these on it, it doesn't matter if he's got a flash hider on that rifle because it's close quarters enough, and in this case it's indoors. The noise of the gunshots are actually going to cause damage to your hearing very immediately. You'll probably have a very bad case of tinnitus as soon as the first shot rings out, and it will be incredibly apparent what direction those shots are coming from because the noise is just so darn loud. So the flash hider, in that instance, still doesn't help them be any more effective at doing their awful deeds. So I don't think that we need to be scared at all of any sort of flash hider. But you never know, I might have missed something or forgot to mention something that would be important in considering whether or not we should maybe be cautious about these devices. So let me know in the comments if I missed something or there's some other point that I hadn't brought up about these flash hiders, how they work, or why we probably shouldn't really care too much about them. Now, that could be different for other muzzle devices, so we're going to look at how other muzzle devices work in our next videos. Muzzle brakes, compensators, and those sorts of things. And see how they work exactly, but then also ask, should we be a little bit worried or cautious about just having them openly available to put on firearms? But I hope you learned something. If you like this sort of content, make sure to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications for juicy content every Thursday and some bonus content on Fridays, and possibly consider becoming a patron of this channel on Patreon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.